2nd. We've got a great panel today and a really interesting topic, and excited to tell you more. All right, there it is, 1 o'clock. So I shall get started. As I mentioned, E2 Tech, Environmental and Energy Technology Council of Maine. Pleased to tell you that we've crossed well north of the 5,000 member threshold. That's across individual members and 335 or so companies across Maine and the United States looking to advance this sector. Thank you for your support. We're so appreciative. We couldn't do it without you. Doing our connecting and convening on behalf of the sector. If I can help pair you with a resource that you learn about today or solve a business challenge that's been frustrating you, let me know. Our events are free for students. And if you paid for today's event, as many of you did, you're making that possible, and we really appreciate that. They're also free for elected officials and anyone with a maine.gov email address. That's part of our Maine-centric mission, advancing the whole sector. We don't lobby or advocate, but we, other than to say, let's promote clean technology, clean energy, renewables, environmental sustainability. That's what we're about. Do not know why I used the Bitcoin logo here. I should probably fix that if you caught that. As always, we're interested and dedicated to increasing diversity among our membership. And we do that primarily through identifying candidates and pairing them with our membership. Many of our members are hiring. If we can help you find a job within our company base, let us help you do that. That's one of the most rewarding things that we do. And another really rewarding thing that we do is work with the Maine Technology Institute. We've got some great member companies that are up and coming, supported by MTI. 2 of them have just joined the Clean Tech Open cohort for this upcoming year. One of them is called Amply.energy. Check them out. And the other is called Shred Electric. Amply does home energy modeling that helps you make decisions about electrifying. And Shred Electric makes an interchangeable battery system that will let you use the same batteries for your outdoor power sports like snowmobiles and Sea-Doos. Check those 2 companies out. Speaking of jobs, summer interns entirely paid for by Dan and his team at the Governor's Energy Office. We'd love to place more of these, and let us help you do that. We've got some great candidates, and I know you've got some great jobs at your company. These are the people on this slide and the next one that make what we do at E2 Tech possible all year long. This is the $2,500 level of support, what we call the sustaining leader. Thank you so much to these companies who really help support the sector in Maine. Bernstein Sure, of course, Portland Law Firm, Central Maine Power, SMRT Architects and Engineers, TRC, Environmental Permitting. I mentioned MTI, and then I'm just highlighting Ørsted, obviously well known for offshore wind work around the world, is our newest sustaining leader. Thank you so much to them. And I always call this our shield. These are the companies that support us year-round through all of our forums, through all of our events, to make what we do possible. If you see a logo here and you are interested in working with one of these companies, please get in touch. Northeast Bank is our bank. Paul is at Key Capture Energy. You could see many of these, EDP just stepped up to this level. We're so appreciative of all of these companies who make this commitment to us year-round. Sanborn Head, well known in the world of PFAS, among many other things. Happy to make connections, and we appreciate their support. And I'm almost done, Paul. I'm going to turn it over to you. I mentioned this was the filler at the beginning while people sign on. So here I am handing it off to you, but I want to promote this event. We have already almost 50 registrants for this event, so we think it's going to be really good. I hope you'll join us. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Williamson. Paul has done many things in this industry, and including working a lot with hiring and so forth, and promoting the sector overall and in wind power. But now he's at Key Capture Energy, and he is today's moderator. So over to you, Paul.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marty. Can you hear me okay at this point?
Yeah, you sound good.
Okay, very good. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. As Marty indicated, we're here today to look at the potential benefits of battery energy storage. The benefits of, let me use the acronym BESS, BESS, battery energy storage systems. The benefits from BESS have been promoted in recent years. Further penetration of renewables and an efficient modern transmission system will require BESS to be part of the system. As the evolution continues to develop in technology, and also as we see changes in market drivers and policy in the last years, we have seen development activity in the state of Maine. And so there are projects that are being introduced and projects in the queue, but we are not seeing a lot of steel in the ground. And there continues to be a little bit of uncertainty about the early stage development of this industry. And so this is intended to be a roundtable discussion to explore the potential, the state objectives, and whether or not further barriers exist that hold storage and storage. While there is a very interesting wide array of new exciting technologies that are under research that may be coming online in the future, today's discussion is really going to be focused on technologies that are currently available for use and development with known practical and financeable applications. And so just want to really set the stage with everybody. There's a lot of different areas where this industry may head in the future, but we're really looking at what's currently available today that could be introduced and provide benefits to the Maine grid as of now. We will be discussing both front of the meter distributed generation storage projects, as well as transmission level system projects. And so that would be part of today's discussion. We will not be digging into smaller systems such as residential and commercial scale systems. With all of that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers today. With us today, we have Dan Burgess from the Governor's Energy Office. He was appointed in 2019 by Governor Janet Mills to be the director of the Governor's Energy Office. And prior to returning to Maine, and which is his home state, Dan had several different roles at Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources and Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. He has a business degree from the University of Maine and a master's in public administration from Northeast University. Also with us today is Senator Eloise Vitelli. She's a Democrat from Aroostook, where her home is, and she represents Senate District 24. She first was elected to the Maine State Senate in 2013. Senator Vitelli has a very broad and diverse background. In particular, I've worked with her in the past on education and workforce development issues. She has a professional life that includes experience as a childhood teacher. She's worked with Maine's Women's Lobby, and she was recognized by the Maine Small Business Administration for her work in career and economic development. And she has served for many years in the Maine Economic Growth Council. In 1995, she was induced into the Maine's Women's Hall of Fame. Also with us this afternoon, we have Michelle Gardner, who is the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs in the Northeast for NextEra Energy. Michelle previously represented Capital Power Corporation in NEPOOL, New England Power. Oh, geez, I'm going to forget that. I'll stick with NEPOOL, and we can let Michelle spell it out for us later. And she's also worked before FERC as Senior Counsel for Regulatory Affairs. Michelle is a graduate with magna cum laude from Catholic University in Columbus Law School and from the College of Holy Cross in 1998. And finally, to round off our panel this afternoon is Liz Delaney, who's the Vice President of Utility Scale Policy and Business Development at New Leaf Energy. She is engaged in New Leaf Energy and regional and national policy initiatives to advance strategic business development activities in targeted markets. She has practiced in front of the Federal Regulatory Commission, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and has technical expertise in a number of different RTOs and ISOs across the country. She also has worked in the Environmental Defense Fund at ISO and has done a fair amount of work and experience with NEPOOL as well. And with that, we're going to go ahead and step into to our agenda today. And we're going to start by hearing from Dan Burgess, who's going to talk to us a little bit about why the state of Maine sees storage as being an important part of our continued renewable energy transition and what the state's goals and processes are currently in place. Dan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Paul, for having me, and Marty and everyone. I'm looking forward to the discussion today. I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and please let me know if there's any issues as I do so.
Looking good, Dan. I'm
Great,
just waiting for Eloise to jump in and correct Paul on how to say arousing. Okay.
That's great. All right. Well, so again, Dan Burgess, Director of the Governor's Energy Office. Going to take a few short minutes just to set the overall context for today's discussion, and I'm looking forward to the dialogue. You know, since the governor came into office, and she's prioritized advancing clean energy and combating climate change, and we've seen that in working with the legislature and Senator Vitelli, especially on things like increasing our RPS, our renewable portfolio standard, to 80% by 2030, and setting a target of 100%. Actually, we've been directed to look at 2040 now by the governor. So taking appropriately ambitious steps to advance the amount of renewables that are in the state. I think that's especially on everyone's minds in Maine these days, as we look at the recent price volatility that we've seen from the global and the global volatility in electricity prices driven by the price of natural gas in New England. And so, you know, we're seeing renewable energy driven by the RPS that is actually bringing prices down, and then and certainly see in the future energy storage as a big part of that. We'll say, you know, the Climate Council, the report that came out, identified energy storage as being critical to, or an important factor for helping us achieve our targets. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the analysis that we've done in Maine. Again, thanks to working with the leadership of Senator Vitelli, Governor signed legislation setting two different targets for energy storage deployment: 300 megawatts by 2025 and 400 by 2030. That made us the 9th state in the country to codify energy storage targets. And if you look at the 400 megawatt target, given the relatively small size of our power sector, that represents about 17% of Maine's load and puts us as one of the most ambitious targets as a comparison to load in the country. So you think about some of these larger targets from larger states, they're certainly ambitious, but when you compare them as a percentage of load, Maine is actually right up there as well. Driven by the legislation passed, our office put forward an energy storage market assessment, which I'll talk about a little bit more. There's a new sales tax reimbursement that was put into place in the second session of 130th for systems that are larger than 50 megawatts. And then again, I think we'll talk a little bit more that Efficiency Maine is doing some really exciting demand management behind the meter programs as well. So there's a lot of activity happening in the state related to energy storage. And our market assessment shows, or asked, some key questions. What storage technologies and use cases are likely to be the most viable to Maine? What policy and market factors can influence speed and predictability? And then what are the costs and benefits of energy storage? And how should we think about that from a policy perspective? I'll note that this storage assessment was done prior to some of the federal incentives that have been passed. And so I think, as we look towards doing the analysis of what would be most beneficial in the future, we'll certainly have to consider some of the recent exciting federal steps as well. So what did our storage study show? It showed that batteries are likely to be comprise most of the storage that's deployed in Maine over the next 5 years, and particularly lithium-ion batteries as this technology is certainly further ahead than others. We think that the study showed that there are multiple benefits to Maine ratepayers, particularly as the value streams evolve. Cost benefit analysis showed, particularly for wholesale or front of the meter storage, that it is cost effective. I think I'm sure we'll hear from the developers on this call about the need to streamline and make sure that those values are accessible in the overall market. But there's certainly it is cost effective when you're looking at it from our analysis. Behind the meter storage can reduce bills and increase resiliency, as no surprise to anyone on this call. And that as technology costs and again, monetization of those value streams those are some of the hurdles that we see now, but if we can overcome those, there's going to be even more value for storage on the system. So when we put out our study, we want to make sure that there was when we were looking at what policy to move forward, that there was both kind of a near-term and a long-term view, and think about this as almost a checklist of some of the things we need to be doing in both the short and long term. So study and based on public feedback that we get as well, that we need to make sure that we're supporting technology neutral approaches that can help energy storage deployment, looking at the development process and what data is needed to track that. We need to continue our policy engagement and leadership, provide information, particularly to local municipalities and tribes that I think may be worried about things like siting and long-term recycling and overall kind of management. It's a new technology coming on to some that are looking at the permitting and siting of this. So if we can provide that information up front, it's helpful. Need to continue to focus on our planning work, and then also continue to do stakeholder engagement as technology changes, as the market grows and changes, making sure that we're staying on the leading edge of the storage policy. Longer term, need to be looking at rate design, continued cost benefit analysis, identifying programs that are needed to help advance storage, and then looking at some of the regional tariffs and wholesale markets to make sure we're accessing those values. Just how are we doing towards those targets? Looking at the latest CELT report from ISO New England, there are more than 63 megawatts of storage operating in Maine. That's that green bar. And you can see the yellow line is our 2025 target of 300, and the blue is the 2030 target. There's more than 450 megawatts planned for Maine, a few large systems and a number of different smaller systems. I think this does not include any of the kind of residential or smaller systems that are not in the not tracked in the ISO New England system, and so we are more than 63 megawatts. I wouldn't say that there's several megawatts out there, but it's likely a little bit more than that. So I think we're on our way. Clearly, we need some of those larger projects to be developed in order to meet those targets, and need to be looking at programs and initiatives to get there. But we did see an increase between last year and this year of storage installed in the state. We're engaged in the interconnection process at the PUC. We are conducting quarterly energy storage forums, which is an opportunity for the industry and policymakers and others to present and provide information. And so I would encourage folks to look at maine.gov/energy to sign up for those. Again, we're tracking the tax incentives, and I know we're going to be talking about potential legislation later today. I will note that there was an entirely separate process focused on distributed generation, so solar that's 5 megawatts and less. And when the modeling and the analysis came back on what a future program could look like, we'll just say that those projects that are paired with storage really increase the value of that distributed generation and what it could do for the grid. And so we're excited to think about what a future solar program could look like that also includes storage. And I won't go through these, I'm sure others may, but just to highlight that the Inflation Reduction Act really does provide a different and advanced suite of energy storage tax credits as well as programs. And these are mostly just the credits, but with all the funding opportunities at the federal government, energy storage certainly has a exciting opportunity to help Maine meet our targets with federal funding. And with that, I think I will pass it back to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. To note for people, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat dialog box, and there will be an opportunity for questions and answers once we get towards the latter part of today's session. And with that reminder, Senator Luis Vitale from Arosec. See if I got it right.
Thank you, Paul. I always tell people that you want to put a little bit of a growl in your pronunciation of Arosec, and that'll get the right emphasis in the right places. But it's delightful for me to be here, delightful for me to see all of you and those who I can't see who are in the audience. I'm going to talk a little bit about the bill that is actually going to be heard tomorrow in the EUT committee, LD 1850, an act to advance energy storage in Maine. But I also want to talk about sort of how I got to this place. Some of what I say may be redundant to what Dan has already said, but I was reminded the other day when a colleague asked me in the hallways here at the State House, so how did you get to be involved in storage anyway? And so I just want to share that I had my first real deep exposure to storage when I had the opportunity to chair the commission to study the economic, environmental, and energy benefits of energy storage in Maine. The report from that commission was published in December of 2019. And what was clear to me then and remains clear to me now is that we can't move forward very far or very fast towards greener energy if we don't include storage in the mix, because one of the things I learned, and I think we all learned, is that the renewable resources that we most count on at this point, wind and solar, are intermittent. And so we need to do something in those interim times when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing to capture the energy that we're going to need to make this full transition. So I just want to share briefly that the commission report came out that unanimously agreed on 4 key issues. One is that energy storage does have the potential to reduce costs and improve reliability. And I think we're starting to see that from what Dan said and what others will say. That clearly energy storage has the potential and does complement and support renewable energies. As I just said, you can't really have one without the other. The other thing that I learned, and I think it remains clear, is that energy storage technology is dynamic and it's evolving. Yes, at the moment, the most reliable market-based energy storage that we have are batteries, lithium batteries, but there are other technologies coming along that we want to make sure we have room for. And then finally, that energy storage, in fact, may be inhibited by existing market conditions or lack of clear regulatory signals. And that's perhaps one of the harder nuts to crack as we try to advance this. But I also want to share some of the other recommendations that came out of the commission based on those 4 clear understandings, because we've also made some progress here as well. We first wanted to establish targets for energy storage development, and we've done that, as you heard Dan indicate. We wanted to make sure to encourage energy storage being paired with renewables and distributed energy through the procurement process, and we've made some progress there. We wanted to advance energy storage as an energy efficiency program in and of itself, and I really applaud the Efficiency Maine Trust for helping us move forward in that regard as well, and clarify that that's in fact the case. We have other things still to do to address electricity rate design issues relating to time variation and costs. I think there's still learning to be done there. Here's a big one. We need to clarify utility ownership of energy storage, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. We need to advocate for energy storage considerations in regional wholesale markets, and I will defer to others to address that larger, broader issue, but it's clearly something that needs attention. And then continue to do studies about Maine-specific uses of energy storage, its benefits and opportunities. Dan referenced the market study, so we've taken some steps in that direction, but it's an issue that as I see it, energy storage is both dramatic in moving us forward towards green energy goals, but also needs to be very iterative in that we need to continue to learn as we move this process forward. So we can't, I don't think, ever say that, yes, we've done that study, we don't need to keep looking at it. I think we're going to continually need to look at the role that storage is playing in our energy mix. So with that understanding, I do want to just say briefly that I was really pleased to hear recently from Efficiency Maine Trust that one of the ideas that came out of some earlier legislation that I sponsored was LD 528. They've conducted some pilot programs, and it was particularly important to me at the time as I looked at the landscape that they look at how storage could play a role in assuring that our critical care facilities had backup in the event of power outages, which, as we all know, we experience from time to time, and to see whether that could be a cost-effective way for these facilities to sustain their power sources. It turns out, from what I'm told, is that those early pilots indeed showed that there was cost benefits to be had, and I think that has led us to what, again, Dan referred to as the additional projects that are now in the queue for further development of larger scale battery storage. So again, that shows me that we can take steps forward, we can learn from what we're doing, we can pay attention, and we need to pay attention to the various aspects of the storage world as we go forward. I'm also personally excited, and I know, Paul, you said we weren't going to really talk about the smaller batteries, but the Efficiency Maine's project that I also learned about that has to do with DERMS, just an odd acronym. Yeah, I want to bring that up. Thank you. What is DERMS? Distributed Energy Resource Management System, which is a way to get people to play in to the grid with some benefit to them and play a role in shaving off the peaks, which is one of the early things that I learned about the role that storage can play as a mechanism for reducing costs overall. And what I like about this process is that it allows individuals, small energy generators, myself would be included in that for my rooftop solar, to play a role in reducing overall costs for everybody. So it's a way for people to buy in to this efforts that we all need to be part of to reduce our energy costs as we transition into clean energy. So I'm excited about this. I'm told that the Efficiency Maine Trust already has the platform that they can use to manage the flow of energy in and out of the grid from these small generators, and that this can play a role in moving us, again, towards our clean energy goals. So now I just want to say a little bit about the bill that's going to be heard tomorrow in the EUT committee, LD 1850. It sets even more ambitious goals for energy storage, 300 megawatts by the end of 2025 and at least 400 by the end of 2030. It also allows Dan's office, the GEO, to reevaluate and increase the state goal biannually beginning next year. So again, we can continue to learn what we need to do just. And then also ask the GEO to submit a report with recommendations studying long-term energy storage options that would help move continuing the process. And importantly, as I mentioned, it directs the PUC to conduct proceedings that will evaluate when and how and under what conditions utilities could have an ownership or an interest in storage itself. So it's one of the things I've heard is going to be important to help clarify sort of the broader market circumstances for developers who are willing to enter this field. So I'm excited about this legislation. I'll be doing it, as I said, this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to this as a vehicle and taking us to the next step in meeting our clean energy goals. I think I'll leave it at that, and we'll turn it back over to Paul.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Senator. And we're actually gonna not let you off the seat just yet. We do have some follow-up questions that we want to just ask you in regards to the legislation. And for starters, let me express some real gratitude on behalf of the industry for the effort that you put into this, and also for the partnering effort that we've seen come out of Dan's office as well. As this legislation is being crafted, we see it as a really fantastic first step in implementing further development and encouraging investment to come to the state of Maine in this sector. With that being said, we really do kind of, as we look at this legislation, we see this as being kind of a entry level piece of legislation that's really kind of looking at how do we get this industry up and going. Well, I know that it's a little bit further out there. Have you thought a little bit, and has there been any discussions about what some follow-up steps might be to really capture the momentum of this legislation and keep things going so that it's not so much of a one-off type of an opportunity?
Well, I would say a couple things, and then Dan may want to weigh in as well. One is, I think, it does keep us going forward. It says to the developing world, we need to continue storage through a long-term procurement process. We've learned through the generation procurement that's one way to incentivize, if you will, the development of wind and solar. So I think the hope is that same mechanism, term process, will work for storage as well. And then I think the other thing is that the more we build this in, the more people are going to understand that this is a critical piece of our green energy direction. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Most definitely help. Dan, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just agree with the senator. Think about kind of the legislation setting that longer term vision. I think oftentimes can bounce from kind of procurement to procurement, and so kind of that structure to look at targets, do the analysis of what's needed, and then move forward is a really, it's kind of a nice direction to see, right? And then I think, the market's changing pretty dramatically. I'm seeing questions about supply chain issues to, what generation resources will be added. And I think as technologies change and as the market changes, it's, incumbent on policymakers to take those into account when designing new efforts and initiatives. And this type of structure that's envisioned, I think, allows us to do that.
Hey, one other question for you. The benefits of energy storage it's not always constrained to state lines. As an example, our company, Key Capture Energy, in recent year, we've started the development of a project here in the state of Maine, and we've done some study on that particular project, and we recognize that that project can actually create hundreds of millions of dollars of ratepayer savings across ISO New England. However, a large amount of those savings would actually happen outside of the state of Maine. And so I'm kind of curious, to what extent has your office and also Dan's office been involved in interstate discussions with other states as they look to incentivize storage, and how can that partnership with other states really help not only capture the benefits, but attract development to Maine for benefits that might be happening out of the state?
well, I'll just say regional efforts are critical on so many initiatives in this state, as in elsewhere. We are part of a broader system. I think the Northern Transmission Line's separate kind of subject, but I think that in itself can also underscore the need to just really pay attention to the regional markets, to our regional partners. We can't achieve any of this alone as a single state. So I can't say that I've had conversations from where I sit with other states in this regard, but I know personally my own commitment is to make sure that whenever we're moving forward in Maine, that we do so as much as possible in concert with our neighbors, because I don't see how we can really do it otherwise.
Yeah, and I think that there's a few ways in which we're working together and we'll continue to work together. One, influencing market design, and where there's at least kind of shared goals amongst the New England states and how to move that forward, including for storage. The other, as the senator mentioned, is an example of the Northern Maine transmission line and working with Massachusetts to share in that project. I think is a really really good example of how states can work together to advance shared goals and targets. And then I think the federal opportunity is really driving states to talk to each other even more, right? We are already in communication through a number of different channels, whether it's NESCO or other entities hosting those discussions, NASIO. And we've got a regional meeting this week with the other state energy offices looking at, all things energy, but there will be discussion of storage as well there. It really kind of, the grant opportunities, the funding opportunities are ensuring that we're spending a lot of time talking, whether it's the hydrogen hub, the transmission funding related to offshore wind. And so I think storage can and should be a part of that, particularly as some of these grant opportunities open up. Some of them are structured. So, Maine put forward your best rural energy proposal and move forward with that. But then there are other opportunities to do that. And I would just say, to the point where anyone on this call or others have ideas about that, about how the states could work together, we are all ears, open door on some of those opportunities, because I do see Maine as a really great place for this work to be happening. And like you said, Paul, a lot of it will support not only the energy and economic development here in Maine, but also overall energy situation in New England. So Caroline Colin from our team is the lead on energy storage, but please reach out to us anytime.
Fantastic. And with that segue, Dan, I think some of those ideas and suggestions might come out of today's discussion. And so I am going to pivot our discussion to the roundtable portion here and start inviting our other panelists to start weighing in here. Real quickly, Marty, if you wouldn't mind sharing that the slide that we've created. I'm going to set the stage here a little bit for some of the people who might be listening in who aren't fully familiar with the entire market and how it's currently situated. Energy storage is kind of a different animal. It's not generation and it's not load, but it acts a little bit like both generation and load. The way ISO New England studies it is maybe a little bit counter to actually how it's operating. And so in our panel discussion, we are going to talk a little bit about what are some of the market dynamics that need to be developed to really kind of capture that difference for energy storage. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about the study processes and some other barriers that are in place that are currently preventing the full benefits of storage from taking place. And so I've labeled this as the locating the best study conundrum. If you take a look at the little graphic here, on the right side, we have renewable energy generation. And just for this very simple example, let's say that we have 1,200 megawatts of renewable energy generation that's coming into a substation that has a limit of 1,200 megawatts at that substation. And then we have power lines going down through to the use, maybe an area with a fair amount of industrial activity. And there's 1,200 megawatts of load that's pulling off of a 1,200 megawatt substation there at that end of the system. Now, one might look at this and say, okay, two really fantastic opportunities for batteries to create a benefit. I can locate that battery on the right side by putting it at that substation. And when there's excess generation coming from that renewable energy, I could go ahead and charge my battery and really make value out of that excess generation that is not being utilized otherwise. However, in the ISO New England study process, they're going to study that battery project as though it is discharging its peak discharge at the time of peak generation that those renewables are generating. So they're going to look at that. And if I have a 200 megawatt BESS system, they're going to look at that and they're going to say, you're adding 200 megawatts onto 1,200 megawatts of generation. Therefore, it's 1,400 megawatts going into that substation. The substation is now overloaded. And so you need to spend many millions of dollars to upgrade that substation before you introduce that battery. Now, if I were operating that battery, or the company were operating that battery, the real goal there would be using the generation when it's at peak and there's excess generation, and not discharging the generation. But, and from ISO New England's perspective, they're concerned that without some kind of guardrails in place, that the battery project could choose to go ahead and discharge at that peak time. And so they're guarding against the worst case scenario. If we look at it from the other end, I go down to the factory end and I say, here's a perfect place for me to put my batteries. I've got a whole lot of load, a whole lot of need for energy, and I can take stress off of the system by adding energy into that area of the load at peak times. Again, it's somewhat of a flip of the other scenario. ISO New England is going to look at the scenario and they're going to say, yes, but what happens if you choose to charge your full charge rate of 200 megawatts at the time that everybody wants to use that 1,200 megawatts of electricity? 200 megawatts of charging on top of 1,200 megawatts of load means that you're stressing that substation to 1,400 megawatts. Substation's overload, so you have to spend millions of dollars to upgrade the substation. And because of this conundrum, we're really not seeing the opportunity to provide the full suite of benefits to the system. And there are ways around this, but currently this is the way the system is operating, and it's creating a fair amount of limitations to how batteries might be developed. And so just setting that stage is a little bit of background knowledge. There's a fair amount of nuances that are involved in there. And now as we start digging into our conversation a little bit further, we'll start to pick apart some of those nuances and also talk about potential solutions. So Michelle, I'm going to start by directing some questions to you. In particular, because we do know that NextEra actually has one of the operating facilities in Maine. There's a battery energy storage project run by NextEra in Yarmouth, Maine. And just talk very briefly a high-level overview of that project, do some of the original motivations of that project, and maybe lessons learned and where you might see some lessons coming out of there where there might need to be some evolution in market drivers.
Great. Thank you, Paul. I just want to say at the onset, obviously, thank you for the opportunity for E2 to be here, and especially thank the Senator as well as Dan from the Governor's office, both for their continued support for the industry and as well the recognition of just how important it is for the state and the region, frankly, to meet all of the clean energy goals that we have in front of us. Because we absolutely agree that storage is a key piece of that. Our company has deployed NextEra Energy Resources is the largest producer of energy from wind and solar, as well as a leader in battery storage. As you noted, Paul, we have a 16.2 megawatt battery storage facility at Casco Bay, and that is adjacent to our Wyman facility. I've seen the batteries on the site. They have been in place since 2016, late 2016. They were designed initially, it is a larger project, as you note. Its design, however, is fairly short from a kind of duration perspective. And so at the moment, although it was merchant build, it is participating in the regulation market and able to kind of bid hourly in that market. It does not currently qualify for ISO New England's kind of capacity or resource adequacy market. And it doesn't currently participate in the reserve market. That being said, we continue to see, I think, as others have noted, a lot of interest in larger scale batteries, both in the ISOQ and kind of moving forward. And I know we'll talk about that collectively. I think you've already identified, I'll just mention very briefly, a few of the challenges, kind of economic bucket, if you will, of those real long-term incentives for developers to come in, to compete, to build, to operate large-scale storage in Maine and then in the region. Economically, the proposal, to kind of create a procurement, I think makes a lot of sense. And then a lot of states, including Maine, have looked at language around kind of an index or kind of a netting. So any market revenues that come or will continue to come, I think just make the project for ratepayers and for the industry kind of more and more economic. The problem is the market, is undergoing a lot of change. And at the moment, I think it's just incredibly difficult to really bid anything based on market revenues. We have seen a number of projects in the queue, and we have seen a number of projects at ISO New England that have cleared a capacity market. But as folks or some folks know that have followed that market, there was only a small period where we kind of locked in capacity revenues for a developer. And so now with some of those changes gone, there's really no guarantee in a year to year. So I think we're still looking at states as kind of that backstop procurement authority. And I do agree that looking for joint models or models with other states to kind of collectively build and procure batteries probably will make the most kind of overall economic sense. I don't want to go too far in the comments. The only last point as we get to it and turn things over to more open discussion is really thinking about transmission, and probably interconnection, and what it means. Paul, you've certainly highlighted one of the challenges, but clearly as well, thinking about the network upgrades and other things that kind of alongside that as ISO studies these projects are quite significant. So I hope we can kind of get into some of that a little bit more on this call.
We most definitely will. But before we go too much further in that direction, I do want to invite Liz to just share some of her preliminary thoughts on market development. And Liz, I'm going to assign you to kind of pick up a little bit from some of Michelle's comments. Michelle did mention a number of different markets: the frequency market, the capacity market, merchant market. For some of the people who might be attending who aren't totally familiar with some of the intricacies of this, would you mind just kind of laying out how batteries actually, currently have a number of different resources that you attempt to stack to see if you can generate the right revenues to support a project like this? Would you mind just giving an overview of what that might look like?
Yeah, that's no problem. Thanks for having me, first of all. And I just want to apologize. I don't know if the rest of you are affected by allergies, but the pine pollen is driving me crazy. And so I'm hoping my voice stays clear for this conversation, but apologies if it doesn't. So thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be part of the panel, and I was very thrilled to see that it coincided with the introduction of this exciting legislation. That was a nice lineup for us to be here today, and I know there's going to be stuff happening in Maine tomorrow. For those of you who aren't familiar with New Leaf, very quickly, we're a developer of solar and storage. We develop all sizes of systems that are front of the meter, so distributed generation or DG, but also utility scale batteries. And we've got a long history of working here in New England and are actively developing in Maine and hoping to develop more. So to your point, Paul, you asked a couple questions about, what are the market revenue streams that a battery storage system has access to, and how do you stack those revenues? So I'll just go through it really quickly. First and foremost, we want to think, well, I like to think about battery storage as a Swiss Army knife. It can pretty much do anything you want it to do, but you need a market signal to tell it what to do. So from the ISO New England markets, we've got energy market as being a primary revenue stream, and we talk about energy arbitrage being buying energy when the price is low and selling it when the price is high, and then capturing the difference. That energy arbitrage revenue stream helps you move the timing of your electricity injection. So let's say it's a busy day, you know you're going to need a ton of electricity at 4 p.m. when everybody's in their houses. You can store up the energy earlier in the morning for a cheaper price, and then when everybody needs it, you can discharge it. Capacity is another revenue stream, and capacity is tied to this idea of overall regional resource adequacy. Do we have enough resources on our system to meet the needs of the system when it's under stress? And so there's a variety of tests that resources need to go through in order to qualify to sell capacity. But if they qualify, they're able to bid into an auction that ISO New England runs for a monthly payment that essentially asks them to be there and be available if needed. Like Michelle was saying, the price that you get paid is not consistent year to year. So you'd lock into a price that you have for 12 months, and then the next year the price resets, and it goes on like that. There's another bucket of revenues called, referred to as ancillary services. Those are things that Michelle was talking about, frequency regulation, where it's tiny little bits of electricity going up and down every 6 seconds, trying to match the balance of the system to your battery to the balance of the system. And then there's things like reserves, which is basically asking a resource to hang back or hold back some of its energy on either a 10-minute or 30-minute basis, because they might need it in the future and you can get paid for that. So all of those are kind of ways that a battery can make money, and we can do it all with battery storage. The only constraint that we see in Maine is that there are a lot of places in Maine where resources cannot qualify to sell capacity because of transmission constraints. They can't pass that test to be able to sell and deliver their energy to load. Finally, I'm not going to touch upon it because, quite frankly, I feel like it's a whole different conversation, but there are uses for battery storage as an alternative to transmission upgrades. They call them non-wires alternatives, or storage as a transmission asset, or storage as a transmission only asset. There's a whole bunch of acronyms, but our company is more focused on the market-facing revenue streams. And so those are the ones that I just described to you. Did I miss anything, Michelle? You know all this stuff better than I do, probably.
No, I thought you did an excellent job.
Okay.
You did mention one thing that I don't know, Paul, and as we think about the kind of hourly or dynamic pricing kind of concepts that have been out there, and Liz, I think you touched upon this. The more our markets kind of generally move towards something that can even identify that emissions reduction. I know PJM, I think in its market, has a website now with some of that information that's posted. Some of the RTOs are moving even just to the transparency of getting that information out there, eventually getting to a place where we have potentially this idea of like an hourly rec or some type of dynamic pricing. That's where you really see a lot of the storage value. To your point, that arbitrage opportunity and the ability to optimize both renewables and storage together is, I think, where you see a lot of efficiencies.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification, Michelle. Just so everybody realizes that the markets are run agnostic to carbon emissions, right? That it does not show up in our prices. And so having additional indicators that help us fine-tune the activities of our storage systems to maximize the amount of avoided carbon is definitely something that can benefit the system. But I think people may not realize that the ISO New England system does not have a carbon reduction target attached to it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because one of the things that we're talking about here, and when we consider efforts such as the senator's new legislation, creating procurement opportunities. Michelle, you kind of touched on this. that's creating some certainty, revenues that make projects financeable. However, when you see that the full value of certain aspects of the market, and you mentioned carbon value itself, Liz, are not baked into the price, that means the states have to then make up that additional value through a procurement. Let's just talk a little bit, and I'll open up this to everybody on the phone, to strategies and maybe directions that the market might have that takes pressure off of the states from having to make up so much of that gap. Anybody want to take that one up?
I mean, I'm really interested to hear from other people, but I can offer that there's a couple different ways that you could do it. One way would be to have a price on carbon in your market. That becomes simple and elegant, but very controversial, and also can have some issues if you're not pricing carbon across your entire system. It can cause some weird perverse incentives where if you're trying to also clean up your gas system, you're not really helping that electrification argument because you're making electricity look more expensive than the gas. Another way to do it is potentially, and that you would get into a lot of jurisdictional hairiness, but putting like a clean constraint on your capacity market somehow, which is basically saying that if you have to buy capacity, there are some proposals on the table right now in the region that would suggest mechanisms can be used regionally to help limit the amount of capacity that each utility needs to procure. That is like set a goal for how much of it is clean, and then the rest can be filled in with fossil. So those are kind of two more market-based mechanisms that would ideally relieve some pressure off the states, but those are slow moving. I mean, I would say the carbon price thing is pretty impossible at this point. It's been a long conversation we've had regionally and just has not gained traction. But I think in the long term, it would be wonderful to see some sort of a clean constraint in the capacity market. But in the near term, I do think the states are not going to be able to avoid needing procurement to help bolster investment. Michelle, want to jump in there?
Yeah, no, I agree. But I will say from a more 100% agree with everything. Maybe over the next, whether it's short term or a year or two, it's nice to start to get visibility. So even if the market hasn't changed, at least starting to publish pricing or provide emissions data, or start to give policymakers information about kind of what this does look like. And I think for storage in particular, to the point of the time, I don't know if location is certainly important, and in location, certainly the kind of nodal signals for development, I think is certainly important. Although frankly, once you kind of bring a clean energy resource into a node, the investment goes away, the incentive now goes away. So you do need some long-term certainty. But I think, again, starting to publish information so that you do start to see some of that hourly differential, I think is helpful, or at least starts to bring us, right? Like we're not there, but at least starting to publish some information. I know Massachusetts has like the clean energy peak, like starting to bring us closer and closer to some of these concepts. I think it's going to be particularly beneficial for storage. The other kind of big item or other thing I think to also mention, and I know Paul had at the beginning, focus on kind of our technologies today. But I do want to introduce another acronym I know the senator had, but mine is DFARS, which is the dispatchable emission-free resources that I know a lot of folks are talking about, which is the group of resources and new technologies that we're really going to need to bring us to clean energy transition. And I think long duration storage is certainly in that bucket. So I really commend the senator and others for kind of including study on this and really looking at this, because as we think about offshore wind, as we think about big transmission, big bets, and the ability to have kind of those bigger units that, as technology gets better and we see those improvements and we see the CapEx of that declining, to start to plan for the long term and those longer term incentives for that type of long duration storage, which, is really, I used to think of it originally as, 8 hours plus, but I know folks now are talking about 12 hours, 24 hour, kind of real long duration storage resources, I think are going to be hugely beneficial on the grid, as we get into 2030 and beyond. And that same comment as well about kind of dynamic pricing and really those arbitrage opportunities there, are really just magnified at that point.
Maybe I'll just jump on, if you think about, look at 5 years ago versus where we are now. I just looking beforehand saw that, 5 years ago, what was in the interconnection queue in 2017 was less than 1% of the capacity in the queue. Last year, about 20 or more. And so I realize not all these projects are going to be built. But as you think about kind of where the market is going and where the development is happening across New England, I think it's exciting to see that. At the same time, in the latest forward capacity market, I don't believe a new fossil resource qualified, at least in Maine, right? And so you can see the market heading in this direction. And I think markets take time to develop. And I think in the meantime, state policies are going to be needed to do that, whether it's the tax credits we've talked about or individual procurements or other means necessary to move that forward. And I think there's a way to do it and should be prioritized for it to be cost effective, right? We're not talking about setting up new programs just to set up new programs, but what's really going to be cost effective for Maine ratepayers. And I think there's we're at a place where the technology is advancing, actually kind of writ large, a number of different areas, not just storage, where the technology is advancing, costs are declining at the exact time, and we are all working on decarbonizing the electric sector. And I guess finally, I would pick up on Michelle's point about long duration storage, and I think that's really an exciting place to see the technology develop and change. And we're seeing pilots around the world, but certainly across the country for some of these new technologies. We've got new plants being built to move that forward, and I think that's a place that we're excited to spend some more time thinking about and figure out what makes sense for Maine when it comes to long duration, and how can we be at the cost effective but leading edge of that long duration world.
Thank you, Dan. And I want to invite the senator to reflect a little bit on some of this discussion. In particular, I saw you nodding when Liz was talking about the challenges with carbon pricing. It appears as though you may have some experience with that. And also some of Michelle's comments on transparency of data helping move the market. You're muted right now. So.
Thought I had just unmuted it. Sorry, I had to switch computers in the middle of this. Yeah, we've been around the carbon pricing. That's politically challenging, but I hearken back to one of my original bills, which was the study of solar. Goes back to 2013, 14, something like that, where, if I'm remembering correctly, there were societal benefits that were identified that could be used to add value just to solar in this case. But I think there may be some other ways that we could look at storage as providing benefits, skirting around the carbon issue at the moment, because I think that's just politically, we're not there yet. I think as we keep going in this direction, it will become more so. I'm hopeful. But at the moment, I think we have to look for other kinds of benefits that we can point to for storage. And I would just say, I think Maine, to build on Dan's statement, I think Maine is well poised to be able to, if you will, sort of experiment or try or test some different ways of siting and using not just the existing storage technology that we have, but maybe some of the new stuff that's coming on. I mean, we have land and water in the state. We've got to take good care of it, mind you. But those are resources that may help us as the technology for storage moves forward into different technologies.
I was just gonna say my apologies. Ironically, I had a storage issue right now, so I plugged back in. So apologize for leaving for a minute. I do agree, and I see, you know, lots of investments. Obviously, the state has made, in particularly up in northern Maine, and in, you know, bringing transmission, helping to you know, bring more to grid, and I think, you know, as we continue to look at Maine as a future for, I think, renewable development in the region, and think about some of the exciting economic development and prospects, and you know, particularly solar and wind coming. Looking at the way that storage, I think, can couple with that, and I really see, to your point, with the land and the water, the ability for Maine to really be a leader going forward. Two quick things that I think about kind of policy wise. I'm always a big fan of using what we have, because oftentimes, you know, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about permitting kind of on the other side, and the difficulties in development. And so the ability that we can kind of use what we already have. So in our case, our battery was already on a site that we owned, and we were able to take advantage of some of that interconnection. So continuing to advance policies, particularly with ISO New England, for resources to use interconnection they already have, because a lot of resource owners do have some surplus space. So that's just kind of a valuable, I think, policy going forward. Again, it's taking advantage of a grid that's there. As well as the ability to take advantage of retirement. So as we see the fossil fuel fleet retire, in other regions of the company, there are options to sell interconnection rights or repower. And in PJM in particular, down in mid-Atlantic, there are rules that allow resource owners upon retirement to kind of sell interconnection rights to another buyer for, I think, up to about 12 months after retirement. So some of those policies, I think, will help as we look at the fossil fuel fleet and look at potential retirements coming, again, taking advantage of what we already have, I think would be really helpful in breaking down some of the barriers with transmission, with interconnection costs, which are not insignificant. And then we haven't spent a lot of time talking about permitting. I know there's right now a lot of support for, you know, tax treatment, things like that, but also thinking about a lot of the permitting challenges that we run into, particularly with storage. There is less kind of land potentially, but also at the local level. So we're finding a lot more you know, certainly safety concerns and things like that certain towns and others are raising, but just thinking about the ways as a developer for us to come in and deploy storage, and kind of trying to deploy a lot of it statewide, and kind of all the different challenges that developers can have kind of across different counties. And Liz, I don't know if you have more on that. I know we didn't spent a lot of time talking about permitting challenges, but certainly difficult on a scale.
I'm going to pick up on the segue that you were talking about, some of the infrastructure, making use of what we have. I think part of the other side of that is one of the things we have is a constrained system at this point. And I presented kind of the location conundrum earlier. I think, Liz, when you were talking about capacity markets, you noted that there's large areas of Maine where you can't qualify for capacity. So let's kind of turn our direction a little bit to transmission, whether or not there's an opportunity here. You know, we often will hear parties talk about the need for further transmission investments to allow renewables to really flourish. What are some subtle changes that might happen in the market where batteries can actually help reduce some of that investment in transmission and make use of what we already have? Liz, I see that you're kind of...
Sure, I'm happy to talk a little bit. I mean, transmission is incredibly important if we're going to electrify and move a lot of load, heating load onto the system. I know there's massive investment that we're going to need, but storage can help play a role in minimizing that by being located in places where it makes the most sense. Now, one of the reasons why we can't locate it where it makes the most sense is, Paul, it's the issue that you pointed out at the beginning, which is that the way that we are studied does not reflect how we operate. So obviously, in order to interconnect to the grid, you can't just plug in anything, right? You have to be studied. The system needs to make sure that it can maintain stability. There's not thermal overloads, and there's a process for that. And the process was built around thermal generators, fossil fuel generators that have characteristics of operating that are very dissimilar to storage. So when you take that when you take the study process and apply it to storage, you have a mismatch that triggers network upgrades and triggers costly upgrades that will not appear in real time because that's not how storage operates. So I think, low-hanging fruit would be to work with ISO New England to revise its interconnection process to have more sensible study conditions for storage. There's also a lot in general that we can do on the interconnection process to streamline, to make more data available so that we're siting in the right places, to speed up timelines, to hold people accountable. There's quite a bit of chatter about this at the federal level and in a lot of different markets. And I think ISO New England is ripe for a broader conversation around interconnection reform. But I would start with honestly just making sure that when we're studying storage, we're actually studying storage and we're not studying a fossil fuel model stuck onto a storage drawing, right?
Michelle, anything to add to that?
No, I agree with everything that Liz said. I think we're, eagerly watching, I think, FERC developments, policy developments. I know the states have done a lot of good work together thinking about planning, transmission planning going forward, and particularly long-term, which is the one area we see kind of a lot of promise in terms of larger scale or kind of long duration storage promises out of planning processes. And so, certainly supportive of all those directions. I think also FERC, we're still waiting to hear about generator interconnects. And to the extent that, something comes out of FERC in the near term and we can get some improvements in the queue and looking at first ready projects and things like that, maybe that will help as well to speed deployment and get some more storage and renewables online.
Yeah. So when we talk about some of these changes that we might like to see and foster, that happens within a process, and a big part of that process happens within NEPOOL. Dan, Liz, Michelle, you all have some experience working in NEPOOL. Just help the audience understand that this isn't, you don't just knock on ISO New England's door and say, please change this. What does the process look like and what needs to happen, and where is the opportunity for partnership between states and industry?
I can jump in a little bit, and Michelle has been around NEPOOL longer than I have, so she can correct me, and I think Dan probably as well. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, ISO New England is our grid operator and our market operator. They operate the transmission system and they implement all of the tariff manuals and procedures. NEPOOL is a stakeholder body, and it is kind of where the conversations happen to make changes to those rules that ISO New England implements. So NEPOOL itself has a separate governance structure. They have an agreement with ISO New England on how they operate together. And behind that are a ton of kind of process rules that help make sure that different people coming to the table have their voices heard in kind of a predetermined and more like as democratic as possible sort of way. I say as democratic as possible, because if you talk to any of us stakeholders, we're always going to complain that we don't have enough power. But for the most part, they try and balance the voices of the people around the table between load interests, generators, suppliers. They do have a large role for states to play. So the states in general can participate directly in the NEPL process by going to the meetings. There's also the NESCO, which is an organization, the Governor's Organization of New England States, that helps organize all the 6 different states and advocate on their behalf. They're a little constrained because they need to make sure that all 6 states agree with what they're saying. So I think one way that states can work with NEPL is by dedicating resources and time to show up and participate in what can be very time-consuming and esoteric debate. It's a marathon sometimes trying to get a policy through, but it's basically there's monthly meetings, and through those monthly meetings, a policy suggestion gets put on the table and everybody works to revise it until it gets to a place where it can be filed by FERC. If there's disagreement, you can fight it out at FERC as well. And then FERC will either accept it, send it back for revision, or they'll deny it. And then the courts can also take up some of the activity. So it's a highly regulated process and pretty labor intensive process, but it is one that is open to the states.
You know, Paul, if I can, the only comment, I agree 100% with everything Liz said. I'm curious. I do feel there may be at times disconnects along the chain from, enacting laws through regulating, through implementing markets, through, the actual kind of steel in the ground and all the decisions and policymakers throughout that chain. And I do think as a community of renewable companies, developers, interests, I have often thought perhaps a closer relationship with the states that are looking to incent the resources that we develop, and having potentially more discussions with policymakers and with folks around from the states, kind of around the NEPL table, and kind of greater connections, because there are times where, as an example, Paul's raised a concern with how ISO kind of studies how load is charged. And it's nice to have synergy and be able to talk to both policymakers that are enacting laws for this, those that are charged with moving forward, but also making sure that that is really represented through the process. And I'll say, this is just me speaking, there are times where I feel developers and the renewable community is facing barriers in the ISO or NEPL process, and I don't think we feel or see the same policy support. And maybe I'll leave it at that, but maybe it's just something that as states and renewable developers, we could do more and more to communicate on some of these issues that really do impact us in the development community.
Any comments, Dan?
No, I was just gonna say both to that. Well, yeah, I think there's always the opportunity for industry to engage more with policymakers, right? I mean, we are not the ones in the market trying to build something or trying to work through the processes. So it's very helpful when we hear from not just the storage industry, but others that, hey, we're running into this roadblock, or you're trying to do this, but this is how it's actually playing out. And I think I've found that to be really valuable from folks or from companies when we hear that, or associations, so that we know what's happening on the ground, and may not always agree or actually be able to do anything about it, but it's helpful to know. I think this similar came to mind when we were talking about local permitting, and there are kind of resources that or let's just say questions at the local level about, okay, what's going to happen with this? What's the environmental impact? How is this going to be recycled? What does this look like? There's a state role for that, and then there's also, it's incumbent on the industry to invest in that outreach to make sure that those questions are answered up front, that there's clarity on all sides about what these are going to look like. And so I think this is evolving, and if anything, it's exciting, at least because we're having these conversations, means that there's more opportunities for development. And just like any other sector that's developing in the energy space, more communication, I think, is helpful across the board.
Yeah,
So I'm
if
gonna
I could
quickly
jump in, Paul, real
yes,
quickly,
please do.
just to reiterate what Dan said, I agree that, because I've certainly heard from developers when they're running into challenges. And so one of my, tenets in putting legislation forward is to avoid putting any more barriers in place. And whenever possible, to remove the ones that are already there if we can. And I will say that working with the Governor's Energy Office has been really helpful in parsing through that, and identifying, where are the barriers that we can address and where are the barriers that lie outside of the state of Maine. So, I think it's a challenge to keep our energy policy both nimble and clear so that we can move this forward. And getting that right is sometimes tricky, but we're working on it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to squeeze in a couple of questions that came in from the audience here, because this great discussion, as typical, we start running out of time. But in particular, as we talk about this location conundrum and also some of the market dynamics, question here about whether or not are these ISO New England specific issues, the location issue, or are there other states that either have similar issues, have overcome those issues?
So across the country, there's been just such a massive and exciting wave of development happening. There was happening before the IRA, but even now with additional federal support, you're seeing volumes in queues across the country fill up, and you're seeing very similar situations, I would say, in most large markets where you have interconnection processes that are slow and not fit for purpose for the volumes that they're seeing. And the storage study issue has also been popping up across the country. So one of the interesting things we mentioned, there's some FERC action. There's a proposed rule at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to reform the interconnection process. And one of the big components of that rule is this storage study issue. So there was so much of it popped up in so many markets that it's risen up as a key issue that the FERC is looking to address, and hopefully their final rule will. But I would say that the challenge around the study conditions is different. Every single market studies things differently, but they're all challenged in the same way where they're not used to studying storage. So I'll stop there because I don't have a great example of someone who solved it. Maybe Michelle has a good example at her fingertips.
No, I wish I did, other than some familiarity with other regions that do study storage differently and don't necessarily look at the peak. I guess just because of time, maybe one other comment, a little related, hopefully okay, Paul. I think the need kind of at the policy level, but more regulatory, is kind of as we look at these units, is it a generation asset? Is it, a load asset, setting aside at the moment transmission versus distribution and the different use cases. But particularly as we charge load and think about this resource, kind of generically, they are subject to obviously charging, from a load perspective. And so depending upon how a utility would look at this resource, they could receive a lot of load charges based on kind of the highest charging day, if you will. And it does seem to me some reforms to really look, and I think this does apply front of the meter, behind, kind of across the board, in how we look at these resources. Because, I don't believe, other than, station service, that any of these resources should be considered load for purposes of charging. And so kind of as we move forward and look to deploy more and more, and then before, we even, larger scale or longer term duration, really thinking about the ways in which we characterize these resources going forward for purposes of regional rates.
Well, I'm afraid that we're getting pretty close here to the end of our time. And so I am going to open up an opportunity for some brief closing remarks from everybody. And really like you to kind of focus on part of what was said today and what you're pulling out of this conversation that's positive that we can build upon. And Senator, we can start with you with that in mind.
Thank you, Paul. Just very briefly, what I've already said, this is a dynamic field. We need to be both nimble and responsive to industry and find ways to make sure that it remains a cost-effective component of our green energy efforts moving forward. I've learned an incredible amount. It's amazing what there is to learn about storage day to day. So I want to thank you all for your contributions. I really appreciate being part of this.
Liz?
Sure. There was a long conversation, a lot of really great stuff, but I wanted to highlight the comment that Dan said about increasing conversations between the state and the developers, and how much I really appreciated you inviting people to reach out to you. It's amazing how much we can assume people know or assume people are aware of, and it is not until you sit down in a room that you realize how much each person has to offer. So my big takeaway, I think, from that is really to reach out to you more often, but also just to encourage others to do the same. And thank you to all of you for joining this and arranging this webinar. I think it's a really great start. I'm super excited about the idea of additional procurements in Maine. And thank you, Senator, for all of the great work you're doing in helping us create a new industry for Maine.
Michelle?
Liz, don't think I could have said it better. Again, thank you for this opportunity. Really excited, I think, as we move forward, think about the state's goals, the regional goals, where we need to go for this clean energy transition. As I mentioned before, a lot of talk of these dispatchable emission-free resources. And what we're going to need moving forward is we see the fossil fleet retire. And particularly reliable resources that we can find when we pair storage and when we think about the future of long duration storage. So really excited, and I'm really excited that Maine is both moving ahead in its program development and its studying. And also want to thank Dan and others for, I think, the continued conversations as we move forward.
And Dan, you get the last word from the panel here.
All right, I'll take 20 minutes speech prepared. Now, thanks, Marty, Paul, and this esteemed panel. I learned a lot myself, and just as we think about our kind of clean energy future, and our office is going to be doing a study focused on 2040, and we'll be doing some more advanced modeling than I think that we've done before. Really looking at what is the system going to need to look like, and not just to meet our RPS, but to Michelle and what others have talked about around kind of this kind of clean, firm resources. And I think storage is going to play a big part of that, and excited to do this work, and would again encourage anyone to reach out to me or the team, maine.gov/energy, and appreciate the conversation.
Well, thank you all for joining us, and this conversation most definitely reminds me of the old adage, not one of us is as smart as all of us. And so all the more important for us to keep these conversations going and keep everybody involved. A lot of big issues, big challenges for us to solve. But we've got a lot of really fantastic resources to move in the right direction to solve those. And with that, Marty, it's back to you.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Eloise, Dan, Michelle, Liz, Riley, of course, Paul. 2 events to tell you that I hope that you will come to. We're all either young or young at heart. This will be a fun event. It's free, and we're going to do a collab with the Maine Outdoor Film Festival this summer. Some curated, environmentally related films. That'll be another fun thing. You're going to get all the slides, including the special ones that Dan and Eloise worked up for this. And you'll also get the full list of questions in the Q&A panel. I apologize that we did not get to more of those, but it was a really great and dynamic discussion. Like many of you, I'll be in the State House tomorrow, not for LD 1850 specifically, although I'm really glad to see that moving along. And anyway, if I see you there, I look forward to shaking your hand. And thanks again for all of your support of E2 Tech. Enjoy your afternoon, and we're going to get the recording to you yet this afternoon. So see you soon at a future event, and see you at the State House tomorrow if you'll be there. Cheers.
Thanks.